Welcome, everyone, to the 2026 Petryshyn Memorial Lecture. I'm Terry Martin. I'm the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who I know is very familiar to everybody in this room and probably to the multitudes on Zoom who are tuning in. Serhii is the Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History here at Harvard, and my predecessor for many years as director of the of HIRI. Serhii, as you may know, is the author of a whole shelf of books, and a very large shelf full of books, and I won't read you the titles of all those books because this would cut into our lecture time excessively. What I would point to is just one element from that bookshelf that I think has made Serhii a particularly valuable contributor to the public discourse around the war in the last 4 years. And that is, like all historians of Ukraine and the Ukrainian national movement and Ukrainian national identity, he, of course, addresses the role of Russia in those processes. This is inevitable. Russia ruled Ukraine, most of Ukraine, for most of the past 300 years. Where he's unique is that he's equally a student of the role of Ukraine in the formation of Russian national identity and the Russian national project, imperial Russian national project, going all the way back to, I think, his second book in English on Mikhail Hrushevsky, on making imperial identity, his book on the origins of the Slavic nations, on Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian national identity, and his book, The Lost Kingdom, in particular, devoted exclusively to Russian national identity. So I think it was this two-sided approach, his equal understanding of the story from the Ukrainian and the Russian perspectives, that situated him perfectly to address the origins of the current and sadly ongoing war, which he did in his book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, about the origins in the first year of the war. And he will return to that subject for us in today's lecture, giving a historian's view of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Thank you, Serhii.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Terry, for this introduction. Thank you very much for coming today. It's an honor and pleasure speaking today. An honor because for a number of years before that, I was the one introducing Petryshyn speakers. It's one of the most prestigious lectures associated with the Ukrainian Institute. So it's an honor now to be in that position of a speaker, be a Petryshyn speaker. And a pleasure because I just discussed that with Terry. This time around, I have no responsibility whatsoever but about myself and my presentation. Everything else is taken care of by the Institute, and the director of the Institute introduces me and will be moderating the discussion. So honor and pleasure. And the title of today's presentation is The Russo-Ukrainian War Through the Eyes of a Historian. And I will, given that Terry skipped most of my publications, I now feel I have to talk about them and fill the gap. But there is another reason why I will mention that. So since the start of the big war, which means the February 2022, have 3 publications on the war. So one of them is the Russo-Ukrainian War, the one that Terry just mentioned, mostly about the origins in the first year. Then the second, it's on the Russian occupation of Chernobyl side. And the third one is collection of mostly interviews that was published by Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute earlier this year. And the origins of all of that research is really in the last collection of interviews. Because the idea to write on the war really was not my own. It came out of the really demand, especially during the first year of the war, in terms of commentary on what was happening there. And I felt I couldn't say no. And then it's once you said yes once, then it becomes more and more difficult to really stop that process. But what I found in these interviews, people from published media, from radio, occasionally TV as well, but TV it's really not where you have more than a few minutes to talk about that. So what I found on the one hand was basically a set of questions. There was also somehow inspiring in a way that a historian, I didn't think that I had much to say on something that happens today or happened yesterday. But the journalist really gave that feeling that allegedly I had something to say. And when I convinced myself that I had something to say, then I kind of retreated in my more natural area and genre, and that's as a historian writing on where I can control the time, I can control the message, I can control the material, rather than maybe responding for the 150th time to the same sort of question. And that's out of that came the book really on the origins of the war, and then the Russian occupation of Chernobyl. And what I'm going to talk about today is very much based on my experience as a historian writing on the war as it is happening, and trying to contribute to the discourse that is happening, certainly influence the opinions about the war, but also at the same time trying to find the ground under my feet as a historian where I can really contribute. What can be, whether it's really a legitimate exercise altogether or not for historians to talk about contemporary developments. And I came up with a list of themes or excuses where I think that historian can add something. And that will be the structure of my today's also presentation. So one thing that certainly no other discipline probably offers for understanding of today is such simple thing as chronology. So putting things in chronological order, I found out that it's so almost refreshing and maybe unusual to the discourse that we have when things are confused, the time frame is confused, and things that happened before are sometimes in the imagination, in the memory, are treated as a reason or as a cause of something that is happening. So I found this really appreciation of chronological tables, something that I really didn't fully appreciate before. Another thing that certainly historians they are doing for the very early time since the beginning of history, maybe as a discipline, it's the origins of wars. So the big events and wars in particular always traditionally were the subject of work of either you think about the Roman authors, Greek authors before that, or the chronicle writers in the medieval Europe and medieval Rus. Another important area where historians really can contribute, that's the history of ideas. That's where certainly every war has some sort of justification, some sort of really intellectual content that is being also debated and fought over in the context of the war. And last but not least, I decided that we historians, we are basically better maybe positioned than others to recognize what is new happening around us today. Because to understand what is new, you have to know what is not new. You have to know what already happened before. And one of the very general definitions of what historians do, they study, or we study, continuity and change. So continuity, it's about something that certainly has deeper roots, and change, hopefully that's something that we can recognize. And the last question that almost every interview would end with it is, what will happen next? What will happen tomorrow? And you resist in a number of ways, not try and get around this question, not answer it, but it keeps coming again and again. And I thought that there is a way also maybe how historians can talk about the future. Talk the future in terms of more continuity, trying to understand the trends that are already there and seeing how they're being changed, and then make some assessment regarding what can happen next. So these are roughly different angles from which I, as a historian, again not being trained to talk about today, was really trying to find my way in that new for me environment. Let me start with something that I mentioned at the very beginning. That's the issues of chronology, but maybe just generally trying to understand the scope of the war, looking at what happened, the wars that happened in the past. When I started to write about that, for me was a big question of where did the war start, the war that we are talking about, the Russo-Ukrainian war? Is it the all-out aggression that started in February of 2022? Or it's more appropriate to talk about the February of 2014 and the start of the operation for annexation of the Crimea? Are we talking about the two wars that were interrupted by some sort of a peace that wasn't really a peace, or this is continuation of the same war? At the end, I decided to define that as one war that started in 2014 and continues until today. As an all-out war, it's now entered the 5th year. And this number of years, number of days is really very important to understand the importance of the war that I am talking about. So if you start counting the days of this war since February of 2014, there are 4,424 days that war is going on. It really almost dwarfs World War II, which went for 2,193 days. If you decide to start counting the days of this war since February of 2022, there will be 1,504 days, which will be approaching now the length of the World War I that went for 1,567 days. So no matter how you slice it, where you start, where you begin, it's a big war. It's a big war, and we know from history that big wars normally happen for a reason, and the big wars really have a major impact on the not just the region, but also this war has certainly implications not just in terms of Europe, Eurasia, but globally, and I will be talking about that. When I started researching and writing the book on the Russo-Ukrainian War, which subtitle is The Return of History, it didn't occur to me to call it The Origins of the War, because the title or subtitle, Origins of Something, normally is reserved for something big. And I didn't imagine when I started to do that in 2022 that we will be dealing with the war of that proportion and that magnitude. So this is the first point that I want to make as a historian. This is a huge war that will really influence to a great degree what will be happening in Europe, in Eurasia, but also globally. The international regime that existed before 2022 is pretty much gone. We are very much in a new environment, and the peace dividend that came with the fall of Berlin Wall with 1989 really came to an end. The post-Cold War era, the era that started with 89, pretty much ended, if not in 2014, then in 2022, and that's I think it's important in its own right. Another way how to look to that war as a historian or ask questions about it is to find some parallels historically. How unique is the war? And I generally put it into the context of the disintegration of empires. So if you look at the map of the world, if you look at the map of Eurasia, you can't miss the one country which is called Russia. It is the largest country in the world. It was territorially the largest empire after, at least in modern era, after the British Empire. So even looking at map, at territory, and that territory shrunk a little bit, but not significantly, it is very clear that you are dealing with the imperial entity. You don't acquire and you don't control the territories of that proportion, of that scope, by being a nation state, or being some sort of non-imperial pre-modern entity. So the story of the disintegration of empires, this is of course a very long story. We can start it in a number of places and in a number of years, but again, we are here in Cambridge, in Boston, not too far from Lexington. So I think it would be only natural to start thinking about the wars that come as a revolts against empires from the American Revolution. And generally, what we see is that the process of the imperial disintegration is a lengthy process. The empires don't die overnight. The American Revolution didn't bring the collapse of the British Empire. It didn't come until the British victory in World War II. It didn't come until post-World War II period. So that's certainly one way to look at that. And the story of the Russian Empire, this is the story of also collapse and then recovery and then collapse again, and now attempts at re-establish control over post-imperial space. So the Russian Empire disintegrated like the Ottoman Empire, like Austria-Hungary in 1918 in particular, and then was put together and stitched together by Bolsheviks, and Terry Martin wrote very well about exactly how that happened. So one maybe reason to think, or at least for me it was very, very interesting, and to think about this war as the war about this disintegration of empire, comes with the legitimization of this war through history by Vladimir Putin in particular. So I don't recall any other war which would start with the historical essay by the leader who launches the war. In that sense, it's quite unique. And I call it the first missile in this war was not really fired in 2022 or in 2014, if you look at the war starting there, but in the summer of 2021 with the publication of this essay on historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Because what I now know, I didn't know that at that time, but that really raised all sorts of alarms in Washington and in other places, because people who were watching at the situation in Russia, in Ukraine at the same time, they started to think that actually there is something serious that might happen. In my milieu of historians, there was complete, basically, I don't know, very, very light-hearted, I would say, attitude toward that essay. It was funny. Do you engage with it? On what level do you engage with it? Wouldn't you provide justification for something that is academically and intellectually really not strong to stand on its own, and by engaging in the discussion somehow you would be holding that particular narrative and create a level of recognition that it doesn't deserve. For me, and I worked before that, Terry mentioned that on the Russian national identity on the 19th century. For me, that was a very clear example of the Russian imperial historical approach, but also Russian imperial understanding of what Russian nation is. Because the main argument of Putin's article, and it is there in the very first paragraph of the essay, the essay is quite long, is that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. This is the imperial narrative of the 19th century. That is Khrushchevsky talking to you through the medium of the Russian president. That's the Russian imperial history, Russian imperial narrative, and Russian imperial understanding of themselves and also of others. So in many ways, when you talk about the ideology of this war on the Russian side, it is deeply imperial. This is a poster coming from the early 20th century, and what you see there is the three figures standing for, this is for Little Russia or Ukraine, this is for Russia, this is for Belarus, the Russian three-color flag, and basically that's the image of metaphorical image of Russia and three unite Russian nation as the concept of that really emerged in the mid-19th century and then continued all the way into the 20th century. So you can see also that only one of these women has a sword and a cross. So there is very little sharing there. There is very clear who is leading, who is inspiring, and who is coercing. So that's very much really reflective of the general idea of how the Russian nation was imagined. There was a recognition of different tribes, Little Russians and White Russians. They were good singers in the case of the Little Russians, and were dancing particular dances, so you can be excited or even have approval of their folkloric elements and folkloric culture, but at the end of the day, it's of course the great Russia that leads them. And this is very much what the essay from 2021 was trying to tell us. Putin was, before the essay, and continues to be very critical, not just about Lenin, whom he suggested he had created Ukraine, but also was critical about Stalin, and he really reason for that was that Putin follows not only in the line established intellectually by Khrushchevsky, but also by people who were writing already during the Russian Civil War and then in immigration. He is a big fan of Ilyin, philosopher. He is a big fan of Denikin. And for them, the whole idea of Ukraine was invention of the Bolsheviks. So again, it sounds counterintuitive, ahistorical, but it's not completely new and fresh idea. This idea of attacking really the communism is associated with the writings of 1919, 1920, and then Russian writings in immigration. So the reason is that the concept of the big Russian nation, consisting of Russian, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, was defeated in Ukraine. Sorry, defeated in the revolution. The Bolsheviks, to stitch together the empire, had to make concessions to the nationalities. And that's why you have the recognition of Ukraine, and then the model that can be used to recognize other republics or even to form other republics. That's certainly not the vision. That's not the model for the future that today's Russian regime has, and why the war started. The war that started under the slogan that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people really suggested that Ukrainians don't exist, didn't exist, shouldn't exist. And when you look at the policies that are being conducted on the occupied territories of Ukraine today, they have nothing to do with the Bolshevik type of understanding of friendship of peoples or recognition of the rights or linguistic or cultural rights, maybe of Crimean Tatars because they're not Slavs, but not certainly of Ukrainians because Ukrainians are really Russians. So there is no need for any separate history, separate culture. That's the future of Ukraine, how it is imagined. That's why the war started. Again, very much as part of the this going back to the sources, to the imperial understanding of the Russian nation, but also trying to project it into the future. What that really means about the nature of the war. There is general discussion and there are good arguments that are being made that it is an imperial war. The special military operation that sounds like a colonial expedition. So, and I make some of those arguments as well. But there is also another theme that is actually maybe not as present in our discussions about the war, and this is the fact that Russians are trying to really create a post-imperial state, in which there would be it would be a Russian nation state. But they include their Ukrainians and potentially Belarusians as well. So they want to become a nation state, but keep the imperial territory very much, or maybe on the occasion expand it. So it's both the empire-saving project and the nation-building project, to take a line from the article, very influential article from early 1990s by my predecessor in the position of professor of Ukrainian history, Roman Shporlyuk, who wrote about that in the early 1990s. That's his definition of the different camps in the Russian debates about the future of Russia around 1990. So he was saying that there were empire savers, those who wanted to save the Soviet Union, and the nation builders who wanted a Russian state. So what we have here is that the empire builders and nation builders and empire savers, they are together. Let me now, so what I was trying to cover so far from the things that I promised you to do. So I talked about chronology and put that war in the comparative perspective in terms of its scope. I looked at the war as really a continuation of the imperial collapse, and I talked about ideology. What I'm trying to go to now, the direction is I want to talk about the immediate causes of the war that come with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. What you see in this image, there are an episode from the meeting of the leaders of the 3 East Slavic republics of the Soviet Union. You remember those ladies, so now those republics are represented by gentlemen. This one is Leonid Kravchuk, the president of Ukraine. This is Stanislav Shushkevich, the speaker of the Belarusian parliament, and Boris Yeltsin of Russia. And they're signing documents dissolving the Soviet Union, which basically a successor state to the Russian Empire, which of course is quite from the perspective of today's Russian ideology, they commit an act of sacrilege, and not against the Soviet Union and not against the communist state that was built there, but sacrilege against the Russian nation, dissolving the representatives of that imperial nation, getting together and dissolving the former empire, dissolving the Soviet Union. A few weeks later, they would be joined by the Central Asian republics as well in the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. But for a moment, for a few weeks, it looked like the ideas of Alexander Solzhenitsyn were coming into life. And Solzhenitsyn in 1990, then still being here in the United States, wrote and published in the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda with multi-million print run the essay that was called How We Should Restructure Russia. And Solzhenitsyn, very much in line with the ideas coming from the imperial past, was saying that, well, of course it's wrong and we don't need really that. That's a burden to have Central Asia or the Caucasus or the Balts, but the future Russia should consist out of mostly Eastern Slavs. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians who settled the northern parts of Kazakhstan. So that was the very much the vision that eventually by 1990s Solzhenitsyn changed his mind, seeing that actually that is not happening. His view was that, well, if this is not happening, Russia should take at least control over the Russian and Russian-speaking territories, which included exactly the territories occupied today by Russia: Donbass, southern Ukraine, Kherson. Again, they're not occupying Kherson, but this. So you can look at Solzhenitsyn's writings from 1999, compare it to the map of today's war, and there would be roughly 95% match. It doesn't mean that Putin or somebody else took Solzhenitsyn and tried to put that on the map. What that really means is that what is happening today is very much functioning within the general framework of this post-imperial Russian thinking and imagination. Now, we hear that from the Russian leadership in the essay that I just mentioned to you, in the interview to Tucker Carlson that Putin gave, and had long discussion about the medieval princess and Kievan Rus. So that's one theme. But another theme in terms of justification of the war was linked directly to the issue of NATO. That was one of the key themes that sounded before the war, and again comes back again and again. Now, where chronology really helps is to look at the beginning of the war and annexation of the Crimea, and try to realize when it is coming and what is the reason for that. The annexation of the Crimea formally takes place in March of 2014. In late February, the Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych flees for Russia as the result of the revolution, Maidan revolution in Kyiv. And the Maidan is there for one simple reason. The Yanukovych promised the Ukrainian nation for roughly 1 year that they were going to sign association agreement with European Union. And at the last moment in late 2013, under Russian pressure, he refuses to do that. The Maidan is there really demands, it starts as a Euro revolution and Euro Maidan. It continues under different slogans into revolution of dignity. But that was the beginning, that was the trigger. Once Yanukovych is gone, the new government that comes into place says that, well, the first thing that we are going to do, we are going to sign association agreement with European Union. And in a few weeks, you have the Russian annexation of the Crimea. In a few weeks after that, you have the destabilization of Donbass and eastern Ukraine. So the war, technically speaking, starts not over the issue of NATO, not over the issue of Ukrainian membership in European Union. It's not on the horizon at that time at all. And the association agreement is not leading to the membership. But it starts on the issue of the Ukraine signed association agreement with European Union. Why it is so important? It is so important because any country, including Ukraine, that signs association agreement with European Union can't sign similar agreement with any other economic or political entity. And the other economic or political entity that is here on the map is, and it emerges and then disappears and reemerges under different names, but basically a Eurasian Union. So what is happening with Ukraine signing association agreement? It's not joining NATO, it's not joining European Union, but it actually escapes from the Russian sphere of influence. So the war in that sense, the way how it starts, the war how it begins, is really the issue of the holding the former subject, the part of the former imperial space in under Russian control. Why Ukraine is important? Why Putin makes this moves that end up to be quite costly for him, less Crimea, but certainly 2022? Well, the reason is quite simple. The Soviet Union fell apart in December of 1991, was dissolved 1 week after referendum for Ukrainian independence. Neither Gorbachev nor Yeltsin were prepared to continue with the Soviet experiment without Ukraine. Why Ukraine is so special? Well, it was the second largest republic of the Soviet Union after Russia. It was also a Slavic republic. It was also traditionally either Orthodox or East Christian republic. And the entire project of rebuilding post-Soviet, post-imperial, whatever name is their space, really would have a huge hole there in Ukraine. So what is happening in Ukraine, what was happening after 91, in 91, what is happening today, what will happen tomorrow, as a minimum, will have a major impact not only on the Russia-Ukraine relations, but also on the Russian positions in the post-Soviet space. Now, does this mean that NATO has no importance or no significance at all? We can make an argument, and I think it would be a legitimate argument, that, okay, so the war was triggered by the association agreement with European Union, but there is a strategic threat that is presented by NATO moving toward the Russian borders. How important is NATO in that story? My reading of that is that NATO is a factor, but NATO is secondary factor compared to the idea of holding control or reestablishing control over the post-Soviet space. Why it is secondary factor? Because after the Bucharest summit, where Ukraine and Georgia were told by the NATO members that actually you will join one day, but we don't want you now, every Western leader was telling Putin that Ukraine is not joining NATO in any foreseeable future. NATO was again on the political agenda in the days and hours leading to the all-out Russian aggression against Ukraine. But the way how NATO was treated by Putin was actually treated in the way that it was used an excuse, but he did everything in his power so that NATO would not be able to make any concessions that would stop the war, because he was already set to start the war. So his demand for NATO in December of 2021 was actually remove your entire infrastructure all the way to the west, to the before the start of the NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, which was, he knew absolutely that it was impossible. Now we learn from the memoirs of the head of NATO that they were prepared to actually remove infrastructure from the Baltic states, for example. That potentially would stop the war, but the war was already in the plans. What we also know from reporting of Western media, that in the weeks leading to the war, Putin's point man for negotiations with Ukraine, Dmitry Kazak, reached an agreement with the head of the presidential administration of Ukraine, where Ukraine was prepared actually to make guarantees or assurances that it's not going to join NATO. Kazakh was removed and the war started. So what we see is not that NATO is not important, but it's secondary in terms of the thinking about the war, and it's of primary importance when it comes to justification of the war. When Finland and Sweden joined NATO, it would be reasonable probably to expect that at least some of the Russian troops fighting in Ukraine would be removed to protect the border with NATO that was now more than doubled. No single soldier was moved there. Actually, the movement continued to be in Ukraine. When the former Russian president Dmitry Medvedev was approached and asked why there is no reaction of the sort that you have in Ukraine to Finland and Sweden, he said, well, because with Finland we don't have, it seems to me, he said, the territorial disputes or some other disputes. So even in that answer, the NATO membership was already put as a secondary factor rather than a primary factor. So we are returning really to a lot of history, the sort of history that I discussed before, and this is not that NATO, European Union don't matter, but what matters really is more an attempt to rebuild and reestablish some form of post-imperial control. I know that I'm pressed for time, so I'll skip a couple of slides and focus on what is new and what is old, what is different, and what is more or less the same in the world that we live in since February of 2022. The first thing that I would say is different is that the war that started under the banner of Russians and Ukrainians, so on, and the same people, pretty much actually ended the history of that idea. This is certainly true about Ukraine. This is the image of the monument to the Russian-Ukrainian friendship that was built in early 1980s in downtown Kyiv. The monument survived the annexation of the Crimea. Ukrainians didn't touch it. But with the missiles raining on Kyiv in February and March of 2022, that's when they removed the monument. And I think it's a symbolic gesture. You go to Ukraine today, you look at the social media. I don't know, the level of hatred, the level of rejection of anything associated with Russian Federation and Russian aggression will outlive certainly this generation. We are talking about a number of generations certainly being traumatized in that sense and affected by this war. We don't know what is happening in Russia today. Actually, the Ukrainian sociologists did research among the Russian prisoners of war in Ukrainian custody. And I understand more than 80% of them actually completely are indoctrinated and share Putin's vision that Ukrainians are Russians, but Ukrainians are kind of a lesser Russian. So a little Russian narrative is there. Long term, the war of that proportion, and with the Russian losses between killed and wounded approaching 1.5 million people. It dwarfs not only Afghanistan, it dwarfs the Vietnam War and all other things. I can't imagine that the body bags that come from Ukraine to Russia really translate the same message that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people or brothers. So I think that in terms of the Russian-Ukrainian transformation of the identity, nation building, this war is a major turning point. This is the Berlin Wall. We don't have Berlin Wall now in Europe, but there is a feeling that it is emerging. And it ends not just the era that started with the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, something that I talked about. In many ways, it ends the era that started with détente and Ostpolitik in the early 1970s, and the Russian oil and gas starting to come to Europe, losing now oil and gas markets and other things. This is a much longer trend. And again, for me, the reflection of that trend is not only a change in rhetoric and also in the behavior of many political leaders in Europe, in particular in Germany, that were very much trying to continue this with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, the sort of relationships that were established by Willy Brandt with Brezhnev back in the 1970s. But for me, Finland and Sweden are really, and their decision to join NATO, whatever will come with NATO, it's almost secondary. But clearly they took the position much more antagonistic is one way to put it, but certainly very much defensive or in opposition to Russia than they did during the Cold War. And this is a very important development. Another major shift that is happening in the world is, of course, Russia losing markets and losing relations with Central and Western Europe, is moving more and more east, which is the east is China. What will happen there, whether there will be a replication of the Moscow-Beijing friendship of the 1950s, how long it will last, we don't know. Historically speaking, we see in the Russian policies 19th century and partially in the 20th century, once Russia suffers a defeat in the West, like it was during the Crimean War in mid-19th century, it goes and compensates in the East. Now it's turning east as well, but the difference is that there is strong and rising China there, something that wasn't there in the 19th century. So we don't know how these relations will develop, but clearly the current move in Russia is to the east, to China, and really performing a secondary role, a supportive role in the alliance. That's a change from 1950s. If in the 1950s it was the Soviet Union that were more responsible player on the international arena, didn't try to destroy completely the order that existed there, and China was more adventurous. Now it's the other way around. And then there is, I don't know, 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion question about the United States. Where is US in all that story? That's where I guess, as a historian, I can't provide much of really insight. We can say that, okay, isolationism is not the first time in the American history. We had that before. We see generally still the trends that are new, that didn't happen in the American history before. Something that you can find in the past, Monroe Doctrine, that certainly rhymes with the past. The sort of the imperial presidency that we have today, again, one can probably draw parallels with FDR during World War II, but I don't think that the parallel is really really very, very instructive or helpful. So we are really in the new world there. And that's where I want to end, really going back to the something that I said at the beginning, that the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war in 2022, the big war, really ended one period in the history of that country, of the region, of the world. It opened the new one. We don't know how it will end, where it will go. The only thing that we know is that history is not physics. And it's not physics because it is very much defined and driven by us. So the way what we think, what we do, how we act really matters. And that's probably the only and the most optimistic thought that I have as the result of looking at this war. No one expected Ukraine to survive for more than 2-3 days or weeks. Ukraine is still there. Miracles do happen. They happen because, in that particular case, because of Ukrainians, because of international support. So that's a very tragic and dramatic story, but it's also uplifting one. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Serhii. So we have a half hour for questions. While you're sort of formulating your questions, I'll begin with one. Yes, yeah, so it makes sense to think of the war in terms of imperial collapse. When you were saying that, and other times when I'm thinking about it, most of the wars of imperial collapse begin as part of the collapse itself, right? The Algerian War, the Vietnamese War, you could multiply them on, and they often go on, or they, flare up and calm down to some degree. And that fits with the Yugoslav collapse as well. It's when you have this strange fact that the war, breaks out, 23 years after that signing document, the small war, and 31 years afterwards. What do you think in terms of sort of the comparison, the collapse of empires, why you get this particular pattern? Knowing that it's not physics.
Right. I think about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, right? And there are, so it's a lot of time for us human beings, but historic time. It's not particularly a particularly big chunk of time. Also, if you think that the key author of the war, in that case Vladimir Putin, is someone who was there in the 1970s, joined the service of the Soviet state at that time, when the Cold War was going the Soviet way. So it's still the same generation that is fighting the war. So from that point of view, it's not a lot of time. And we can, if we accept that, we can ask why now and why not in the 1990s. And I think a lot would be, of course, about the origins of the Russian state coming out of the liberal revolution, really.
Yeah.
But the state itself in the 1990s was formed by the wars. So the empire, in my opinion, is one of the key factors that stood on the way of democratic Russia, because it started with Chechnya. Mm-hmm. And then it continued with Georgia and with other things, and that became a wonderful instrument for the leaders to bring back and reinstate very authoritarian forms of government. But again, the war became the again, not the only one, but certainly I think one of the most obvious reasons for Russia not continuing on the path of the early 90s.
Do you think there's any? I sometimes, when I'm thinking about this delayed action phenomenon, I do. You're not supposed to make any comparisons to Nazism, but I do think of the German, wars, which also, break out about, 20 years after the collapse of, the German Empire, and after a period of kind of domestic trauma of sorts combining with imperial, trauma, sort of the collapse of the 20s and depression and that. I don't know whether that has any validity.
Yeah, I refuse to be politically correct in that sense because I think it's encroachment on really our turf of historians. So if you don't do comparative research, what do you do? Mm-hmm. And I think that those parallels are there. And again, the comparison of Russia in the 1990s with Weimar Republic, they come from Russia.
Yeah.
The comparison of the annexation of the Crimea with Anschluss, it comes from Zubov, from Russia. So it's not really nasty Westerners or Ukrainians or Balts or someone else who has these ideas. The Russian scholars, journalists, and others have these ideas as well. So I think that's certainly very, very close parallels. And I found also parallels in the policy of appeasement. That's for me, it's unescapable. Again, at that time, toward Germany, and then when it comes to Russia, really Germany becoming the appeaser in chief. I think that that's also this element of the sort of delayed.
Yeah.
Delayed. You need some time also for the troubles, of course, happening in Germany with Great Recession and in Russia in the 1990s. But you also need some period of time to rebuild the capacity to fight the war. And it's interesting that at Yalta, when they were thinking about the peace and thinking about Germany, they were thinking in terms of 20 years. So 20 years, and they looked, of course, at the experience of Germany. And you look here, the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, and you have 2014 roughly 20 years.
Okay.
Oil prices is a major factor.
Right. Great. Let's take some questions. There first. Wait for the microphone and the questions, please.
Hi, thank you. So I have two questions, and they're both connected with straddling your discipline, your identity as a historian, and being thrust into this world of fast-breaking commentary. So one is that I'm always just very curious on how you balance how your news consumption habits have changed, right? Because all of a sudden reading a newspaper becomes, something different than it was before 2014. And somewhat related to that, are there any examples you could share of instances where you see non-historians citing historical examples that they're not misusing consciously, they're not attempting to abuse, but just grasping at historical parallels without really knowing the full picture and kind of doing either more harm than good, or just making comparisons that you as a historian feel are it would be better if they hadn't been made.
Right. Yes, thank you. So with my news consumption, it's really was a challenge to given my background and training as a historian, to write on something that is happening and you don't really know what happens today. It is so important today there was the entire civilization was about to disappear yesterday night, right? And wow. And I don't know what will happen tomorrow. There can be another wow, 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 or oh my gosh. And that's a constant, certainly almost agony of trying to recognize what is important, what is about trend, what is something that will not be important tomorrow. And then also writing something that without obvious ending, because we historians, we are trained to write about something, the processes that came to an end. So and that was the experience with the book on the Russo-Ukrainian War. And then I ran with my book on Chernobyl. I had the beginning and the end. There was occupation, the start of occupation, the end of the occupation, and oh my gosh, and things were not happening on the daily basis. So despite the fact that it was only 1 year and a half removed from me, it was so more familiar, so easier and less stressful to work on that than you are working on something that is happening. And I really started to appreciate the talent of journalists, and in particular, I told Anne Applebaum, I can't imagine how you can do that, because you have to capture that today. It has to appear in the newspaper tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And you still have to confront readers that read that maybe 1 month or 2 months from now. So that appreciation really came only when I confronted myself that. And in terms of the uses and misuses and abuses of history, yeah, on the Russian side, it's a very clear narrative. That's one line that is there, and then another one is really our American world, our Western world, where there is really a very superficial knowledge outside of this room and outside of this building of the history of the region. And again, you can't escape also our president's remarks on Russia and history and what was there and who was winning in World War II. So that's the most obvious one, but generally there is that sort of lack of knowledge, lack of information, and I guess there is nobody else I have to blame but myself, because it's my task allegedly to educate the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in your thoughts on a potential historical comparison you haven't made. So something that you've mentioned and something I'm interested in is the resistance of Ukrainian society, and to what extent this is something similar that we've seen. As a political scientist, I think about kind of other contemporary contexts, but I'm interested in your thoughts of that, to any parallels maybe in World War I or World War II, whether that's like the home front in Western Europe or maybe the Soviet Union. I wonder if this is something you've thought about.
Yes, thank you. The one thing that, again, you write about today and research it, and it is very much informed by what you know about the past. But understanding today also informed, or at least not dramatically maybe changed, or maybe changed, my also understanding of parts of history, right? So looking at the way how the Russian army wages the war today in terms of complete disregard for human life of their own soldiers, civilian population, but their own soldiers, I started to understand World War II and the victories of the Red Army. And I'm not saying that later my family, my grandfather was in the ranks of that army. So you suddenly start realizing, okay, I read that, it was there, but I missed it. I didn't understand it. I didn't fully appreciate it. It's not like the sources were not suggesting that, but I didn't have that sensitivity. And in terms of the Ukrainian society, the most interesting thing for me was this research on the Russian occupation of Chernobyl, because the Ukrainian operators who were there, they found a way to resist in a number of ways, using their knowledge of physics and sometimes blackmailing the Russian occupational force about that they can do something with the equipment that they actually couldn't do. And then in the company town where most of them lived, they created the territorial defense units, and they were fighting against the occupation with arms in their hands. Now, why this is, I found that somehow particularly interesting. The place where they come from, the company town Slavutich, this is the last Soviet city ever built. It was built after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster to replace Pripyat. And it was an all-union effort, so you can think about that as basically last imperial project and last imperial city, which means there is basically a multi-ethnic population there. And many of them come from Russia, got education in Russia. They're not just Russians from Ukraine, they're Russians from Russia. They and the similar situation with Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, those company towns, they were voting for Yanukovych. And then the war starts and happens, and they unequivocally take the side of Ukraine. And that I thought, okay, that's maybe explains why Ukraine is still there. This is a phenomenon of a political nation, not exactly your origins, ethnic, or your language, but your attachment to already displaced or political institutions. And I don't think that existed in Ukraine in 1991, or even in 2014 when the started the Crimea and the war. And there is one case, Orthodox priest in that city of Slavutich, who then was just running on the Russian troops when they moved in. And he was interviewed later, and he said that he came from Western Ukraine, and he was speaking Ukrainian, and before the start of the war in 2014 was considered in the city to be a nationalist because of his language. After 2014, they started to, not all, but a lot of people started to consider him to be pro-Russian because his church was the Moscow Patriarchate. Mm. So the same person doing the same things, but perceived very differently before the start of the war and after the start of the war.
A couple of questions that came in over the transom on Russia and the imperial consciousness in Russia, and whether you see any prospect in the aftermath of the war of any transformation in that towards accepting itself as a nation state, or whether this is sort of going to be a ongoing conflict, even if it turns into a Cold War rather than a hot war. And some questions about support of Russians for Putin during the war. How much of this is Putin? How much of this is more Russian society?
In terms of Putin versus Russian society, it becomes more and more difficult to separate. It's very clear that we know that the war was planned in secrecy. It was a shock to many, even in the high command. But as I said, now 80% of people in Ukrainian POW camps who have all the incentives actually to denounce Putin, right? Still basically say that that's they shared that sort of opinion. And with Russia experiencing probably the largest political immigration from the country after 1917, with increasing control over the media, now shutting down the internet, I think that with every passing day it would be more and more difficult to separate Russians in general from Putin. In terms of the impact of this war, a lot depends on how it ends, right? So if it ends with something that Putin declares to be victory and it's bought as victory, the idea basically thinking and going ahead was, okay, we did everything right. We lost a lot of people, but eventually we got our victory. We were right. Наше дело правое, right? And if it is something that is not a victory and triggers really some sort of crisis, which I think Russia is heading toward crisis, it seems to me, one way or another, that would be a very different take on that. But one thing that I think still will change irrespective of the end of the war and who wins, who loses. And I look at the one city in Ukraine, which has this multiple names, Lemberg, Lviv, Lvov, and Nicholas II wanted Lvov and went there, and in 1915 celebrated Easter in Peremyshl, right? And Stalin wanted Lviv, and got it, and Putin doesn't want it.
Yeah.
And the question is why, and the answers can be provided of multiple nature, but somehow after the nationalist resistance of World War II and post-World War II, that is not considered to be Russia anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I think that again, the scope of the war, the number of people killed, the damage that it's enormous damage to Ukraine, but it's not good for Russia in one way or another. I think that it can be delayed, but I think that there will be a rethinking.
George Grabovich.
No. Thank you for your lecture, Serhii. I have a question that relates to the two previous questions in a particular way. That is to say, the first question was about how often we must respond to immediate events because they're changing things fundamentally. But I want to look at the longue durée, and that was implied by the second question about society. The longue durée is, I think, from the Ukrainian historian's point of view, would be the formation of the Ukrainian nation formation. And in that, I was wondering what, to your mind, because arguably, before I go into the question itself, arguably this is the last phase of Ukrainian nation formation. That is to say, a process that was begun probably by the mid-19th century by Shevchenko, if you will, or at least that's where my focus seems to be now. And lasted through the formation of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, and then the dissident movement, and then the Maidan, which you alluded to, and specifically you alluded to the taking down of that monument of the eternal unity of Ukraine and Russia, which happened in the first year of the war. What are the phases as far as you can tell now? That is a very technical question because it assumes knowledge from everybody present that they would know what the phase of the late 19th century, for example, is before 1918. But what are your proposals here?
Yes, thank you. So we historians, literary scholars, intellectuals want to think, and there are some good reasons for that, that we are the ones who imagine and create nations, or through poetry or through our research. Yes, we contribute to that process. But it's major cataclysms, and wars in particular, that really attach big masses of the population to a particular sort of ideas and visions. And in Ukraine, what we see is, again, the war is enormous in terms of the proportion, in terms of the destruction. But at the same time, we see the story of probably the majority of the nations that acquired the independence in the 19th and 20th century. They go through the wars. Wars is more a norm of the disintegration of empire and acquiring of independence than not a norm. And in Ukraine, a major transition happened between the idea that people went on December 1st, 1991, and they were asked, do you want to support the decision of the parliament that Ukraine should be independent? And 90% said yes. And then 1990s, very difficult times. People were changing their mind, not changing. The majority still stayed in favor, but there was changes of that. After 2014 and especially 2022, this is a very different commitment to the idea of the state when people are actually going and risking and sacrificing their life. So it's not, they're now defending the choice that their parents made back in 91. That's a very different quality of the group. That's a very different relation to the idea of the state. And I would say that in this war, what is happening is that Ukrainian society really discovers for the first time a state that is not considered to be antagonistic, is not foreign, it's not outside, but the state that also helps to protect them. And that probably never happened in Ukrainian history, for at least in modern history. So this is a big historical change.
Rob? No, wait for the microphone, please.
Well, I think my voice.
It's on Zoom.
A comment and then a question. Earlier you mentioned the expansion and contraction process for Russia.
We don't have a lot of time, so be brief. Be brief, please.
I will. This ties in with a service state argument that relates very much to what you were speaking about. Ivan III, Peter the Great, Stalin, three service state relations with Putin has attempted a fourth, which I think is failing. He doesn't have a party, he doesn't have a dynasty. Nonetheless, if we look at what happened between 1654 and 1765, from Paris-level agreements, the 13 Years' War started, and then the absorption of Ukraine into the Russian Empire, there is a stage of annexationist mentality and process here. And so looking into the future, what is your perspective here? Say at some point there's an armistice and the Russians get some territory, but they over the next few, or many decades, in salami slice fashion, or more so, possibly Russia again will reignite hostilities. It is looking into the future now.
Yes, thank you. And this is, you expect a question about the future from a journalist, you don't expect from historian. So I'm really again, what I can say that what I don't expect, let's start with things that I don't imagine happening. I don't expect Russia falling apart in any dramatic way. I don't expect Chechnya staying to be part of Russia, and maybe some other non-Slavic groups that would not be Russified. But most of Russia will stay together, because my understanding of today's Russia undergoes bloody but normal process, post-imperial process of reimagining itself as a nation. But part of that process also, in case of Ukraine, would be really, I don't see how they could do that unless they completely occupy and destroy Ukraine. That war, in my opinion, will separate Russians from Ukrainians. So the thing that Putin doesn't want Lviv, I think that the chances are that whoever will be next in Russia will not want Kharkiv, right? So that's what I think. Again, chances of that happening are high. And then you will have a situation where there is a big country with a lot of resources, will try to influence the countries in the region without necessarily destroying them. So we can look at Georgia as an example, right? So that policy can continue, but it's already a very different sort of relationship that would come out of that. So I think that the power dynamics in the region where Russia is the biggest player with most of the resources will continue, but I think that the war will change at least nature of the game in terms of Russian-Ukrainian relations.
Okay, on that note, we've come to the end of our time. And I'd like to thank Serhii for an entertaining and instructive lecture and discussion.